The coal dust hadn't even settled on Marcus Thorne's boots when the first scream echoed through the mountain hollow, a sound that would haunt the valleys of Appalachia for decades to come. It was March 1840, and the paranormal investigator had arrived in the remote settlement of Crow's Ridge, responding to a desperate telegram about missing girls. But what he found waiting in those ancient hills was far worse than any supernatural case he'd investigated in his 15 years of chasing shadows. The mayor's daughter, 12-year-old Elizabeth Hartley, had vanished 3 nights prior, making her the 7th girl to disappear since winter's end, and unlike the others, her father had enough money to summon help from beyond the mountains. Marcus stood at the edge of the Hartley property, watching the sun sink behind the tree line while Mayor Hartley paced the porch, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. "They take them young," the mayor whispered, his voice barely carrying over the evening wind, "always before their 13th birthday, always from families who've lived here longest." The investigator's practiced eye caught movement in the upstairs window of the house, a curtain shifting despite no breeze, and he made note of it in his leather journal. The same one where he documented possessions in Boston and hauntings in Philadelphia, though something about this place felt different, older, hungrier. The truth about Crow's Ridge began revealing itself that first night when Marcus interviewed Sarah Whitley, Elizabeth's best friend, an 11-year-old whose hands trembled as she spoke. Elizabeth knew they were coming for her, Sarah said, her green eyes wide with a fear that seemed too mature for her age. She found something in her grandmother's attic, papers about a deal, about promises made before any of us were born. The girl pulled a crumpled page from her dress pocket, written in faded ink that looked brown like dried blood. And Marcus recognized the language immediately, not English, not Cherokee, but something far older that made his skin crawl despite years of studying the occult. According to Sarah, Elizabeth had discovered that every prominent family in Crow's Ridge had signed something called the Hollow Pact in 1798. When the settlement was first established, trading their future daughters for prosperity in the harsh mountain terrain. "Every 42 years, Sarah whispered, glancing at the darkening windows as if something might be listening. "They come to collect 7 girls from 7 families, and this is the year." Marcus calculated quickly in his mind. 1798 to 1840 was exactly 42 years, and his investigative instincts sharpened as he realized this wasn't random folklore, but something methodically planned. The investigator's first real lead came from an unexpected source. Old Man Morrison, the town drunk who most dismissed as mad, but who'd been alive long enough to remember the last collection in 1798 as a young boy. "Weren't no strangers that took them girls," Morrison slurred, clutching Marcus's arm with surprising strength outside the tavern. "Was their own kin that handed them over, met them buyers at Hollow Creek under the new moon, exchanged them for gold that turned to leaves come morning, except for 1 coin per family that stayed true." The old man's eyes cleared for a moment, deadly serious. "That gold built this town. Mr. Thorne, every building, every business, every fortune here grew from that seed money." Marcus spent the next 3 days mapping the disappearances, finding a pattern that spiraled outward from Hollow Creek like a spider's web, each taking occurring closer to the center than the last. Elizabeth Hartley would have been the 6th, meaning 1 more girl remained to complete the cycle, and based on the pattern, she would be taken from the founding family closest to the creek, the Whitleys. Sarah Whitley, the very girl who'd brought him the evidence, was likely the final target, a realization that sent Marcus racing back to the Whitley farmstead as storm clouds gathered overhead. The Whitley house stood isolated at the mountain's base, a 2-story structure that seemed to lean away from Hollow Creek, as if trying to escape its proximity. Marcus found Sarah's parents, John and Mary Whitley, in the midst of a violent argument that stopped abruptly when he entered, and he noticed immediately the small leather pouch on the kitchen table, filled with gold coins that seemed to pulse with their own light. "You can't let them take her," Mary was sobbing. But John's face remained stone, his hand resting protectively on the pouch. And Marcus understood with sickening clarity that the transaction was already in motion. "Your ancestor signed the pact," John Whitley said flatly, not meeting Marcus's eyes. "My great-grandfather, one of the 7 founders, they needed the land to prosper, needed protection from the things that lived here before us. And the arrangement was made." The farmer's weathered hands shook slightly as he spoke, revealing the internal war between paternal love and generational obligation. Every family got their turn at prosperity, 42 years of wealth and success. And then the payment comes due. Mary Whitley suddenly grabbed Marcus's arm, her nails digging deep. "But they never come back, Mr. Thorne. Not one girl in 42 years ever returned. And no one knows where they go." The investigator had faced demons wearing human faces and humans with demon hearts. But the calculated nature of this arrangement chilled him deeper than any possession. These weren't random kidnappings or supernatural predation, but a business transaction spanning generations, where daughters were currency and prosperity was purchased with innocence. Marcus pressed John Whitley for details about who exactly collected these girls. And the farmer's answer made the investigator's blood run cold. "They ain't exactly people anymore. If they ever were, they come from inside the mountain, through doors that shouldn't exist." That night, Marcus set up his equipment in the Whitley barn, with a clear view of both the house and the path to Hollow Creek, determined to document whatever came for Sarah. His kit included an early model camera that had captured spiritual manifestations in New Orleans, electromagnetic compass variations he'd developed himself, and bottles of blessed water from various faiths that had proven effective against different entities. Sarah had been told to stay in her room, windows locked, wearing an iron pendant Marcus had given her. But as midnight approached, the investigator watched her bedroom window slowly slide open from the inside. The girl emerged like a sleepwalker, barefoot despite the cold, moving with unnatural grace down the porch steps and toward the tree line. Marcus followed at a distance, noting how the forest seemed to part for her, branches bending away, roots sinking deeper into the earth to smooth her path. And he realized she wasn't being taken, but summoned, drawn by something that bypassed conscious will. The temperature dropped 20 degrees as they neared Hollow Creek, frost forming on Marcus's beard, though it was barely autumn, and ahead he could see figures gathering in a clearing, shadows that moved independent of any light source. 6 girls stood in a circle beside the creek, each in their nightgowns, each moving with the same puppet-like grace as Sarah, and Marcus recognized Elizabeth Hartley among them, despite the strange luminescence that seemed to emanate from beneath their skin. They weren't harmed, not physically, but something fundamental had changed in them, their eyes reflecting light like cat's eyes, their breathing synchronized, as if they shared one set of lungs, and when they spoke, it was in perfect unison. The 7th completes the offering, the door opens, the payment is made. Before Marcus could intervene, the ground at the center of their circle began to crack, not breaking like normal earth but peeling away like old paint, revealing a darkness underneath that seemed to pull at the very air around it. The investigator had read about such things in forbidden texts, dimensional rifts that connected our world to others, usually requiring massive energy or specific celestial alignments to open. But here was one opening as easily as a cellar door, fed by something about these specific girls, these specific bloodlines. From the opening came a hand, then an arm, then something that might have once been human, but had been transformed by decades or centuries in whatever lay beyond that threshold. Its skin was translucent, showing dark veins beneath that pulsed with borrowed life. Its eyes were solid black, but somehow conveyed ancient intelligence. And when it spoke, its voice was layered, as if multiple beings shared one throat. The 7 families have prospered as promised. The payment is due. The cycle continues. More figures emerged behind it, each one wearing remnants of clothing from different eras. And Marcus realized with horror that these were the collectors, the girls taken in previous cycles, transformed into these servants of whatever power had made the original pact. The investigator acted on instinct, throwing one of his blessed water bottles at the nearest creature, and the reaction was immediate and violent. The thing shrieked, its translucent skin bubbling where the water touched, and the synchronized breathing of the 7 girls broke for a moment, Elizabeth Hartley gasping as if surfacing from deep water. "Run!" Marcus shouted, but only Sarah responded, stumbling backward while the other 6 remained frozen. And the investigator realized the others had been here too long. The transformation already beginning. Sarah's scream when she saw what was emerging from the portal snapped her father into action. John Whitley charging into the clearing with an old rifle, but the bullets passed through the creatures like they were made of mist. "The coins!" Mary Whitley cried out, arriving behind her husband. "They're connected to the coins." She held the leather pouch high, and the creatures immediately turned toward her, their black eyes fixed on the gold, with unmistakable hunger. And Marcus understood. The gold was more than payment. It was a physical anchor to the pact. The investigator grabbed the pouch from Mary and threw it into the portal, watching as the creatures dove after it with desperate urgency, their forms becoming more solid as they passed through the threshold. "The pact is void if the payment is returned," Marcus shouted over the increasing wind that seemed to emanate from the opening. "But we need all 7 coins." John Whitley's face paled as he admitted he'd already spent his coin on new farming equipment. The gold now transformed into mundane metal and wood, irretrievable. The portal began to pulse, expanding with each beat like a living heart, and the 6 transformed girls started walking toward it in perfect synchronization. Elizabeth Hartley turned to look at Sarah one last time, and for a moment her eyes cleared, becoming the bright blue they'd always been. And she mouthed a single word: "Remember." Then she stepped through the threshold, followed by the others, disappearing into that impossible darkness that seemed to exist between spaces rather than within them. But the portal didn't close, instead growing larger, and from deep within came a sound that was neither voice nor roar, but something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to primitive fear. "The pact is broken, but the debt remains," the layered voices of the collectors announced. "If not the daughters of blood, then the daughters of choice. 7 souls must cross before the sunrise, or all prosperity turns to ash, all protection fails, and the original inhabitants reclaim what was theirs." Marcus had investigated enough supernatural contracts to know the danger of broken pacts, the cascading consequences that could destroy not just individuals, but entire communities. The original inhabitants the creatures mentioned weren't human. He could feel that in his bones. They were something older that had been pushed out by the Founders' deal. And if they returned, Crow's Ridge would face something far worse than losing 7 girls. The investigator made a desperate decision, pulling out his journal and beginning to sketch a containment circle around the portal with blessed chalk, hoping to at least limit its expansion until they could find a solution. The chalk lines glowed faintly as he completed each section, and the portal's growth slowed but didn't stop, pressing against the barriers like water against a dam. "We need 7 volunteers," Marcus announced to the growing crowd of townspeople who'd been drawn by the commotion. 7 people willing to cross over to maintain the balance. Or we find 7 of the original coins to restore the pact. The silence that followed was deafening. No one willing to sacrifice themselves. No one admitting to still having their family's coin. Sarah Whitley stood at the edge of the circle, tears streaming down her face as she stared at where Elizabeth had disappeared. And Marcus saw her beginning to step forward before her mother caught her arm. "There has to be another way," Mary pleaded. But the investigator's experience told him otherwise. Supernatural pacts were binding beyond human law, written into the fabric of reality itself, and breaking them carried consequences that couldn't be simply wished away. The mayor arrived with a strongbox from his office, containing what he claimed were 6 of the original coins, gathered from families who'd kept them as heirlooms, but the 7th remained missing. "The Morrison family," someone in the crowd whispered. Old man Morrison's family had the seventh, but he drank away their fortune decades ago. The coin could be anywhere. The portal pulsed more violently against Marcus's barriers, cracks appearing in the chalk lines, and the investigator estimated they had maybe an hour before it broke free completely. The search for the seventh coin became a desperate race through the town. Citizens tearing apart Morrison's shack, digging through the tavern's floorboards, checking every place the old drunk might have hidden or lost the family treasure. Marcus remained at the portal, reinforcing the barriers with every technique he knew, but he could feel them weakening. The power pushing through was older and stronger than anything he'd encountered. Patient and inexorable like the mountains themselves. It was Sarah who found it, or rather, remembered where Elizabeth had said she'd seen it, sewn into the lining of an old coat in the Hartley attic. A coat that had belonged to Elizabeth's grandmother, who'd been a Morrison before marriage. The coin was tarnished but intact, humming with the same unnatural energy as the others. And when Sarah brought it to the clearing, the portal's violence decreased noticeably, responding to the proximity of the complete payment. 7 coins. 7 girls, Marcus said, understanding the symmetry required. But the girls are gone, transformed, absorbed into whatever lies beyond. He looked at the assembled townspeople, their faces pale in the pre-dawn darkness. The coins must go through, but someone must carry them. Ensure they reach whatever power holds the other end of this pact. The mayor stepped forward, his political bearing crumbling under genuine guilt. I brought you here, Mr. Thorne. I started this. I should... But Marcus cut him off with a raised hand. The investigator had spent 15 years documenting the supernatural, cataloguing the impossible, building a reputation as someone who could explain the unexplainable. But standing at the edge of that portal, feeling the pull of something vast and hungry beyond human comprehension, Marcus understood that some mysteries weren't meant to be solved, only survived. He took the 7 coins, feeling their weight far exceed their physical mass, and prepared to do what he'd always done. Go where others couldn't. Face what others wouldn't. Wait, Sarah Whitley said, her young voice cutting through the tension. The pact said daughters, specifically daughters, and what if... She pulled out the crumpled page she'd shown Marcus days ago, reading the original text with growing excitement. It doesn't say human daughters, it just says... daughters of the founding families. What if we could substitute something else? The crowd murmured in confusion, but Marcus immediately understood, his investigator's mind racing through possibilities. The farm animals, the livestock that had been bred through generations. They were technically daughters too, descended from the original animals the founders had brought. It was a desperate interpretation, a loophole that might not work, but given the alternative, Marcus decided it was worth trying. Bring 7 female animals, he commanded, 1 from each founding family's oldest bloodline, quickly. The townspeople scattered, returning with a bizarre procession, a cow, 3 chickens, a pig, a sheep, and an old hound dog, each from families that had kept careful breeding records since the settlement's founding. Marcus tied the coins around each animal's neck, whispering the names of the missing girls, attempting to create a symbolic substitution that might satisfy the letter, if not the spirit of the pact. The animals were surprisingly calm as they approached the portal, as if they too were being called by something beyond the threshold. One by one they walked through, disappearing into that impossible darkness, and with each passage the portal contracted slightly, its violent pulsing diminishing. When the 7th animal, the old hound, stepped through with a mournful howl, the portal snapped shut like a closing eye, leaving only scorched earth and the lingering smell of ozone. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the first birds of dawn beginning their songs. The townspeople stood frozen, uncertain if the substitution had worked, if the pact was satisfied or merely delayed, and Marcus knew they wouldn't have an answer immediately. Supernatural contracts operated on their own timeline, their consequences unfolding over years or decades, and all they could do was wait and watch for signs. But something had definitely changed in that moment of closure. The very air felt different, lighter somehow, as if a weight that had pressed down on Crow's Ridge for 42 years had finally lifted. Marcus noticed the frost melting rapidly despite the cold morning, flowers that had been wilting suddenly straightening, and most tellingly, the shadows cast by the rising sun fell normally instead of bending toward Hollow Creek as they had since he'd arrived. Sarah Whitley stood beside him, older somehow despite her 11 years, marked by an experience that would follow her forever. "They're not coming back, are they?" she asked, and Marcus knew she meant Elizabeth and the other girls, transformed into something else, existing in a place between worlds as servants or worse. The investigator couldn't lie to her, wouldn't insult her intelligence with false hope, so he simply shook his head and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The weeks following the portal's closure brought no peace to Crow's Ridge, only a different kind of terror that crept through the settlement like fog through the valleys. Marcus Thorne remained in town, ostensibly to document the aftermath, but truly because he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with how easily the substitution had worked. The 7 farm animals had satisfied an ancient pact that demanded human souls, and in Marcus's extensive experience, dark powers never accepted such trades without extracting a different price. The first sign came exactly 13 days after the portal closed, when Mary Whitley woke to find her daughter Sarah standing at her bedroom window, staring at Hollow Creek with eyes that reflected light in the darkness. "She was there," Sarah whispered when her mother touched her shoulder. "Elizabeth was there in my dreams." But she wasn't Elizabeth anymore. She was something wearing Elizabeth's face. And she said the trade was accepted but incomplete. The girl's hands were ice-cold despite the warm night, and when Mary lit a candle, she noticed Sarah's shadow fell in 2 directions, as if cast by different light sources. Marcus interviewed Sarah the next morning, finding her lucid but changed, speaking with a precision that seemed unnatural for an 11-year-old. "The animals we sent through," she said, fixing him with an unblinking stare. "They carried the coins, but not the essence. Mr. Thorne, and essence is what feeds the thing beyond the portal. Essence is what it truly bargains for." When pressed about what she meant by essence, Sarah only smiled, an expression that didn't reach her eyes, and said that Elizabeth had shown her things in dreams that couldn't be explained with words. The investigator began noticing other changes throughout Crow's Ridge, subtle at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing day. The prosperity that the original pact had brought didn't fade as expected, but instead intensified in disturbing ways. Crops grew overnight to unnatural sizes. Livestock gave birth to litters twice the normal number, and gold veins previously exhausted in the local mine suddenly renewed themselves. Mayor Hartley found his daughter's room filled with coins one morning, exact replicas of the 7 that had gone through the portal, and when he tried to remove them, they reappeared by nightfall. John Whitley confided to Marcus that he'd been having visions of his ancestors, not dreams, but waking hallucinations, where his great-grandfather stood in the corner of rooms, mouth moving in silent words that John somehow understood anyway. "He keeps saying the pact was never about the gold or the girls," John said, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey with unusual urgency for midday. "It was about anchoring something here, creating a bridge that couldn't be severed, and we didn't close it. We just changed its nature." The farmer had aged visibly in 2 weeks, grey streaking through hair that had been solid brown, lines etching deeper around eyes that held a haunted quality. Marcus decided to investigate Hollow Creek directly, bringing his equipment to where the portal had opened, and what he found there defied explanation, even for someone versed in the paranormal. The scorched circle remained, but within it reality seemed thinner. Sounds echoed strangely, and compass needles spun without pattern. More disturbing were the footprints that appeared at sunset, Small bare feet that materialized in the dirt and led from the circle toward town, only to fade as the sun fully set. And Marcus recognized the size and gait as matching the 7 missing girls. The town's doctor, Samuel Green, sought Marcus out with troubling medical observations about the citizens of Crow's Ridge. "People aren't aging properly," he said, showing Marcus detailed records he'd kept. "Some are aging rapidly, years in weeks, while others seem to be growing younger. And it's not random, it follows bloodlines, specifically the founding families." The doctor's own hands showed this disparity. His left hand spotted with age, while his right appeared decades younger. And he admitted he was descendant from 2 different founding families, creating a visible conflict in his very flesh. Sarah Whitley's transformation accelerated, her intelligence expanding beyond natural limits, while her emotional responses dulled to almost nothing. She began writing in languages she'd never learned, filling journals with symbols that hurt to look at directly. And when Marcus attempted to photograph these writings, the images developed, showing not the pages, but glimpses of that dark place beyond the portal. In one photograph, he could make out Elizabeth Hartley, standing in an impossible corridor that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Her expression blank, but her eyes screaming. The other children in Crow's Ridge, those not from founding families, began reporting shared nightmares about the missing girls returning but wrong, walking through walls, standing at the foot of beds, whispering promises about a better place where pain didn't exist because nothing existed except the eternal service to something that had waited so long to manifest fully in this world. These dreams were too consistent to be coincidence, too detailed to be simple nightmares, and Marcus recognized them as psychic intrusions, something from beyond using the children as conduits. Old man Morrison, despite his drunkenness, became increasingly coherent about memories that couldn't be his own, speaking in detail about the original pact signing in 1798. "Weren't just the 7 founders present," he told Marcus during a moment of unnatural clarity. "There was an 8th, something that came up from deep in the mountain, older than the Cherokee, older than their stories even, and it offered them everything they wanted for such a small price. Just 7 daughters every 42 years, barely noticeable over time." The old man's eyes rolled back as he spoke, showing only whites. Yet he continued talking, as if seeing something else entirely. Marcus discovered through research in the town's archives that Crow's Ridge sat on a geological anomaly, a place where several underground rivers converged in patterns that shouldn't exist according to conventional geology. The waterways formed a 7-pointed star deep beneath the earth, with Hollow Creek at the center, and each founding family had built their homestead at one of the points. Whether by design or supernatural influence, he couldn't determine. The formation had been there long before human settlement, carved by forces that predated recorded history. The animals that had been sent through the portal began returning, but like the girls in the nightmares, they came back wrong. The Whitley's cow was found in their barn one morning, alive but changed, its hide showing patterns that shifted when viewed directly, its milk black as oil, but sought after desperately by anyone who tasted it, creating an addiction that spread through the founding families. The chickens appeared in the Morrison property, laying eggs that contained not yolks but small objects, coins, teeth, photographs of people no one recognized, but everyone felt they should remember. Sarah's journals became increasingly frantic, her controlled demeanor cracking as she documented what she called the merger, a process where the boundary between Crow's Ridge and wherever the portal led was dissolving gradually. "They don't need the portal anymore," she wrote in a shaking hand. "The substitution we made didn't close anything. It transformed the connection from violent to subtle, from taking to infiltrating, and every dream, every vision, every impossible thing that happens makes it stronger." Marcus found her one night trying to burn all her journals, tears streaming down her face, the first genuine emotion she'd shown in weeks, the founding. Families began experiencing what Dr. Green termed genealogical haunting, where they simultaneously existed in multiple time periods of their bloodline. John Whitley would be milking cows in 1840 while also clearing the land in 1798, aware of both moments equally, unable to distinguish between present and past. Mary Whitley aged and grew young multiple times daily, sometimes appearing as an old woman at breakfast and a young bride by dinner, her memories shifting with her appearance, but somehow maintaining continuity. Mayor Hartley called a town meeting that devolved into chaos when several citizens began speaking in unison, repeating words that Elizabeth had said weeks ago, but in voices that belonged to things that had never been human. The seven were not payment but preparation, they chanted, vessels shaped through generations for a specific purpose, refined bloodlines capable of existing in both spaces simultaneously, and now that they've crossed over, they serve as permanent anchors. The possessed citizens then collapsed, remembering nothing, but the message was clear. The missing girls weren't victims, but tools in something far larger. Marcus attempted to contact colleagues from Boston and Philadelphia, other investigators who might help, but his letters returned unopened. And when he tried to leave Crow's Ridge to seek help personally, he found himself back at the town's entrance, no matter which direction he traveled. The settlement had become isolated from the outside world, existing in a bubble where geography folded in on itself, where the same road could lead to different destinations depending on when you traveled it, where the sun sometimes set in the north and rose in the south. The transformation of Crow's Ridge accelerated with the autumn equinox, reality becoming increasingly malleable as the boundary weakened further. Buildings aged decades overnight, then restored themselves by morning. The dead were seen walking through town, conducting business as if still alive, and worst of all, the seven missing girls began appearing simultaneously in multiple locations, each appearance slightly different, as if they were being filtered through various layers of existence. Elizabeth Hartley was seen by dozens of witnesses in her home, at school, by Hollow Creek, and in the mine shafts, all at the exact same moment. Each version performing different actions, living different possibilities. Sarah Whitley's condition deteriorated to the point where she existed more in the other place than in Crow's Ridge, her physical form becoming translucent during certain hours, solid only when the sun was directly overhead. She spoke to Marcus during one of her solid periods, her voice overlapping with itself as if multiple Sarahs were speaking from different timelines. The pact was never about payment, Mr. Thorne. It was about evolution, about preparing humanity for conjunction with something that exists outside dimensional constraints. And Crow's Ridge is the prototype, the test case for something that will spread if successful. The investigator found himself documenting not a haunting or possession, but a fundamental alteration of reality itself, where the laws of physics bent to accommodate something that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. His equipment registered energies that oscillated between existence and non-existence, temperatures that were simultaneously freezing and boiling, electromagnetic fields that flowed backward through time. Every measurement contradicted itself, every observation changed what was being observed, and Marcus realized he was witnessing something that human consciousness wasn't equipped to fully comprehend. The other 6 girls who had passed through the portal began manifesting more frequently, but unlike Elizabeth, they appeared exactly as they had been, unchanged and seemingly unaware that anything was wrong. They attended their daily routines, went to school, ate dinner with their families, but no one could touch them, their forms passing through solid matter like projections. Yet they could manipulate objects when they chose, opening doors, writing messages, leaving physical evidence of their presence that shouldn't be possible for apparitions. Marcus discovered that the original pact document, which Sarah had shown him that first night, was changing. New words appearing in the margins, written in fresh blood that never dried. The additions revealed the true nature of the agreement. Not a simple trade, but an invitation, permission for something vast and alien to slowly merge with our reality, using the founding families as focal points. The 7 daughters taken every 42 years weren't payments, but preparations. Each cycle strengthening the connection until full manifestation became possible. The crops that had grown so unnaturally began displaying impossible characteristics. Corn with kernels that showed moving images when examined closely. Wheat that whispered when the wind passed through it. Apples that contained not seeds but tiny bones arranged in ritualistic patterns. Those who ate these foods reported visions of other worlds, some beautiful beyond description. Others so horrifying that several citizens attempted to claw out their own eyes rather than continue. Seeing, the founding families seemed immune to the negative effects, instead growing stronger, younger, more vibrant with each impossible meal. Dr. Green made a disturbing discovery when examining blood samples from the founding families under his microscope. Their blood cells were transforming, developing structures that shouldn't exist in human biology, crystalline formations that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions when viewed from certain angles. "We're becoming something else," he told Marcus, his voice mixing fascination with horror, not dying, not even really changing, but adding to ourselves. Becoming more than human while still remaining human, existing in multiple states simultaneously. The investigation took a darker turn when Marcus realized that he himself was changing, despite not being from a founding family. His exposure to the supernatural over 15 years had prepared him in ways he hadn't understood, made him sensitive to dimensional fluctuations that normal humans couldn't perceive. He began seeing the world as the missing girls must see it, layered realities stacked upon each other. Infinite variations of every moment existing simultaneously, and the terrible knowledge that something vast and patient was slowly pulling all these realities toward a single point of convergence. Sarah Whitley disappeared completely on Halloween night, not taken or transported, but simply ceasing to exist in the conventional sense. Her parents found her room empty, but somehow still occupied. Her presence felt but not seen, her voice heard but not sourced from any direction. She left behind one final journal entry that read, "The 7th daughter was always meant to be the bridge, not crossing over but existing in both places permanently. And I understand now why Elizabeth smiled when she went through. She saw what we're becoming, what Crow's Ridge is becoming, the first settlement to exist properly, without the limitations of single-dimensional thinking. The November snows came early and wrong, falling upward in some places, forming geometric patterns that hurt to perceive directly, melting into water that reflected not the sky but other places, other times. Marcus documented 17 different types of snow falling simultaneously, each originating from different atmospheric conditions that couldn't coexist in conventional physics. The founding families walked through this impossible weather unprotected, their bodies adapting instantly to contradictory temperatures, their children playing in snow that should have frozen them solid or burned them with its heat. The revelation came to Marcus through fever dreams that weren't dreams at all, but memories belonging to someone else, someone who had investigated these same mountains centuries before Europeans arrived. He woke in the Morrison shack, where he'd taken temporary residence, his journal filled with entries in his own handwriting that he didn't remember making, documenting an investigation from 1594 by a Spanish conquistador named Eduardo Torrens, who had followed native warnings about a cursed valley where reality grew thin. The entries were in perfect Renaissance Spanish, a language Marcus didn't speak. Yet he understood every word, as if they were his own thoughts. Torrens had found something in these mountains that the Cherokee had been guarding against for generations, not worshipping but containing through careful rituals and deliberate avoidance. The entity, for lack of a better word, existed primarily in spaces between spaces, in the gaps between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, and it had been trying to manifest fully in our reality for millennia. The Cherokee knew that direct confrontation would only strengthen it. That acknowledgement was a form of invitation, so they had built their settlements in specific patterns to create a kind of psychic cage, keeping it dormant through organized disbelief. Marcus found himself walking to Hollow Creek in the pre-dawn hours without conscious decision, his feet following paths that hadn't existed the day before but had always been there. The creek now flowed in 7 different directions simultaneously, each stream visible only from specific angles, and where they converged, Sarah Whitley stood, solid but wrong, her 11-year-old form containing something infinitely larger. "You're beginning to understand, Mr. Thorne," she said, with a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. "Why you were really brought here, why it had to be you specifically." The investigator who had encountered enough of the impossible to serve as translator between what was and what's becoming, the girl who was no longer just a girl, explained that paranormal investigators like Marcus were rare bridges, humans who had exposed themselves to enough supernatural energy to exist partially outside normal reality while maintaining their sanity and analytical abilities. Every case you investigated, every entity you documented, each one left a mark on your consciousness, expanding your ability to perceive beyond human limitations, Sarah continued, her form flickering between child and something geometric that hurt to perceive directly. "And now you can serve your purpose to document the transition, to help humanity understand what it's becoming so the process can accelerate beyond this single town, through Sarah or through the thing speaking through Sarah." Marcus learned that the entity had no name because names were human constructs that couldn't contain its nature. It existed as a kind of living mathematical equation that resolved differently in each dimension, and Earth was simply one variable in an infinitely complex calculation that was working toward a specific solution. The founding families had been selected not randomly, but because their genetic structures contained anomalies that made them capable of existing in multiple dimensional states without completely losing coherence. The investigator was shown visions of other settlements throughout history where similar attempts had been made. A Viking village in Greenland where the entire population had vanished overnight, leaving behind only ice sculptures that moved when unobserved. A Mayan city where the residents had transformed into living stone that still grew and changed. A monastery in Tibet where the monks had achieved enlightenment by becoming one with something that existed in the spaces between prayer wheels' rotations. Each attempt had failed because the human element hadn't been properly prepared. But Crow's Ridge was different because the entity had learned from each failure. Marcus watched the sun rise, but also not rise, the dawn occurring and not occurring simultaneously, and realized that Crow's Ridge now existed in a state of quantum superposition, where all possibilities were equally true until observed. And even observation only collapsed probability temporarily before it expanded again. The founding families had adapted to this impossible state, their consciousness stretching to accommodate mutually exclusive truths. And their children were being born with abilities that shouldn't exist. The Morrison baby who aged and grew younger with each breath. The Hartley twins who shared one body but cast 7 shadows. The investigation became increasingly difficult as Marcus's own nature began to shift, his meticulous notes becoming paradoxical, describing events that had happened were happening and would happen all in the same sentence. He found entries in his journal dated from years in the future, describing the complete transformation of Crow's Ridge into something that existed simultaneously in all times, where death was merely a change in perspective and birth was just another form of arrival. The handwriting was his, but aged, desperate warning of consequences he couldn't yet understand. Elizabeth Hartley materialized fully in the town square at noon, but she was all 7 missing girls simultaneously, their features overlapping impossibly in one face that smiled with 28 lips. "We were the experiment," they said to the gathered crowd, testing if human consciousness could maintain individuality while existing as part of something larger, and we succeeded by failing. Dissolved but preserved, gone but present, and now we serve as proof that humanity can evolve beyond the prison of singular existence. The crowd didn't flee because fear required a frame of reference that no longer applied. The entity began manifesting more directly as winter deepened, not as a physical form, but as an alteration in how reality functioned around Crow's Ridge. Mathematics stopped working conventionally. 2 + 2 could equal 4, 7 or purple depending on who was counting and why. Time flowed in eddies and currents, with some buildings experiencing decades, while others remained frozen in single moments. The cemetery became particularly unstable, with the dead climbing out not as zombies, but as confused individuals who didn't understand why they had been lying in boxes underground when they had work to do. Marcus interviewed these returned dead, finding them completely rational except for their inability to understand that they had ever been gone. Thomas Hartley, Elizabeth's grandfather who had died 5 years prior, insisted he had just been at the general store yesterday, which was true from his perspective because yesterday and 5 years ago were the same moment from certain angles. The more Marcus tried to explain linear time, the more confused both he and Thomas became, until the investigator realized he was losing his grip on conventional causality. Dr. Green's medical practice became surreal as patients arrived with conditions that defied medical science. A woman whose heart beat backwards, pumping blood into her body from the outside. A child who had been born elderly and was aging in reverse toward conception. A farmer whose left half existed on Tuesday while his right half remained on Saturday. The doctor adapted with disturbing ease, developing treatments that involved adjusting probability rather than addressing symptoms, prescribing medications that didn't exist yet, but would work retroactively once invented. The transformation wasn't violent or catastrophic, but insidious. Reality shifting so gradually that abnormality became normal before anyone noticed. The founding families thrived in this new state, their businesses succeeding through impossible means. The Whitley farm harvested crops before planting them. The Morrison mine extracted gold from veins that existed in parallel dimensions. The Hartley General Store sold items that customers didn't know they needed until they had already purchased them. The economy of Crow's Ridge operated on principles that would have driven outsider economists insane. Sarah Whitley returned to her parents' home for dinner, sitting at the table as if she had never left. But she occupied all the chairs simultaneously while also standing in the doorway and lying in her bed upstairs. Her parents adapted to this multiplication with disturbing ease, setting places for all versions of their daughter, carrying on conversations where each Sarah responded differently, creating a chorus of possibilities that somehow harmonized into family dinner. Marcus watched from outside, no longer sure if he was observing or remembering or predicting. The investigator discovered that his equipment had evolved along with everything else. His cameras now capturing not just images, but the probability clouds of potential images, showing what might be rather than what was. His electromagnetic sensors detected fields that flowed through dimensions he couldn't name, and his compass pointed not north, but toward the center of something that existed outside conventional space. Every tool designed to document the paranormal had become paranormal itself, infected by proximity to whatever Crow's Ridge was becoming. The town meetings became exercises in quantum democracy, where everyone voted on all possibilities simultaneously, decisions being made and unmade in the same moment, policies existing in superposition until someone needed them to be specific. Mayor Hartley governed through probability manipulation, his decrees becoming true retroactively, reshaping the past to support present needs. When Marcus pointed out the impossibility of this system, the mayor simply smiled and showed him the town charter. which had always stated that Crow's Ridge operated through consensus reality rather than conventional law. Children born after the portal incident were different at a fundamental level, their bodies existing normally but their consciousness spreading through dimensions like roots through soil. They played games that involved shifting between realities, hide and seek where the seeker had to search through multiple timelines, tag where being it meant existing in a state of quantum uncertainty. These children looked at Marcus with pity, seeing him as handicapped by his inability to fully perceive the new nature of existence. The weather in Crow's Ridge became completely unpredictable, not chaotic, but operating on rules that changed based on observation. Snow fell upward on Tuesdays unless someone expected it to. Rain came from underground on the full moon, and sometimes the sun forgot to set until someone mentioned it was nighttime. The founding families instinctively understood these patterns, their bodies adapting to impossible temperatures, their crops growing in defiance of seasons that no longer applied conventionally. Marcus found himself losing track of his own history. Memories that he knew were his feeling foreign, while impossible experiences felt familiar. He remembered investigating cases that hadn't happened yet, writing reports about events that would only occur if he didn't document them, creating paradoxes that resolved themselves by making both outcomes simultaneously true. His journal became a maze of temporal loops, each entry referencing others that didn't exist until they did, creating itself through the act of being read. The entity's presence grew stronger as winter deepened, not manifesting directly, but expressing itself through the increasing impossibility of daily life. Horses ran backward to their destinations, arriving before they left. The church bell rang yesterday's hours today, and tomorrow's sermons were preached last week. The mine produced ore that transformed based on need, gold when wealth was required, iron when tools were needed. Sometimes materials that didn't exist in the periodic table, but served purposes that wouldn't be discovered for generations. Elizabeth Hartley visited Marcus in his dreams, except they weren't dreams, and she wasn't visiting so much as he was existing temporarily in the space where she now lived. "You're documenting the birth of a new form of human existence," she told him, her child's face containing eons of knowledge, where consciousness isn't trapped in single moments or bodies, but flows through possibility like water through a river system. She showed him visions of Crow's Ridge in hundreds of different states simultaneously, thriving and abandoned, ancient and newly built, existing and never founded. The investigation reached a crisis point when Marcus realized he could no longer distinguish between what he had experienced and what he had documented. His notes described events from his own perspective and from the perspective of people he had never been, including detailed accounts of the original pact signing in 1798, as if he had been present. He found himself possessing memories of being Eduardo Torrens, the Spanish conquistador, of being the Cherokee shaman who had first detected the entity, of being Sarah Whitley, writing in her journal about things that wouldn't happen for decades. The final transformation began when Marcus discovered he had been writing letters to himself from different temporal positions, each one arriving before it was sent, creating a correspondence that existed outside causality. The letters detailed instructions he didn't remember following, but must have, because the results were evident in the increasingly unstable reality around him. One letter, dated from 1798 but written in his hand on paper that wouldn't be manufactured until 1889, contained a single line: "You were there when it started, because you will be there when it ends." And ending and beginning are the same moment, viewed from different angles. The revelation shattered Marcus's concept of self as he found evidence that he had been every investigator who had ever come to these mountains. Not reincarnation, but simultaneous existence. The same consciousness experiencing different temporal positions, like fingers on the same hand. Eduardo Torrens's journal, which he had thought he was reading, was actually being written by him, as he read it, creating itself through observation. The Cherokee shaman's warnings that he had discovered in the archive were prophecies. He was speaking through borrowed lips. Centuries before his birth, Sarah Whitley appeared in all her multiplicities to explain what Marcus was becoming, her 11-year-old form serving as anchor for something that existed across all ages simultaneously. "You're not just documenting the transformation, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice harmonizing with itself across octaves that shouldn't exist. "You are the documentation, a living record that exists in all times where Crow's Ridge exists, which is becoming all times as the boundary dissolves completely." She showed him his reflection in the creek, but instead of one face, he saw thousands, each slightly different, each representing a possibility of who he was, had been, would be. The town itself began experiencing temporal hemorrhaging, with buildings aging centuries in seconds, then reverting to lumber and nails before being built again in architectural styles that wouldn't be invented for decades. The founding families moved through these transitions without concern. Their consciousness adapted to existing in multiple states, conducting business in stores that were simultaneously grand emporiums and empty lots. Children attended schools that hadn't been built yet, learning subjects that didn't exist, preparing for futures that were already past. Marcus witnessed the original pact signing, not through vision or memory, but by actually being present in 1798, standing among the founders while also investigating their descendants in 1840. He watched himself arrive in Crow's Ridge, observed his own investigation from the perspective of the entity, experienced his own discoveries as revelations and remembrances simultaneously. The 7 founders weren't making a deal with something external, but with their own future selves, trading daughters who would become bridges for prosperity that existed because they would eventually create it. The entity revealed itself not as an alien presence, but as what Crow's Ridge was becoming, had always been becoming, would have always become, a point where human consciousness evolved beyond singular existence into something that could perceive and inhabit all possibilities simultaneously. The missing girls hadn't been taken, but had volunteered from a future perspective, knowing they would become the template for humanity's next evolutionary step. Elizabeth Hartley was every girl who had ever disappeared, and none of them, existing in the spaces between identities. Dr. Green's final medical notes, which Marcus found himself writing despite never studying medicine, documented the complete transformation of human biology in the founding families. Their DNA had become fluid, restructuring itself based on need and circumstance, allowing them to exist in environments that changed faster than adaptation should allow. Hearts beat in quantum superposition, simultaneously pumping and not pumping blood that existed in probable states until observed. Pregnancy lasted anywhere from days to decades, with children being born at whatever age they needed to be for their purpose. The mine beneath Crow's Ridge revealed itself as not extracting minerals, but mining reality itself, pulling possibility from the quantum foam and crystallizing it into whatever the town needed. The miners, descendants of founding families, worked shifts that lasted seconds and centuries, their picks striking stone that existed in multiple dimensions, extracting wealth that was conceptual until it became physical through observation. Marcus found himself working alongside them, had always been working alongside them. His investigators' tools transformed into mining equipment that extracted truth from probability. Christmas arrived in all seasons simultaneously, the church bells ringing carols that hadn't been written yet, while snow fell upward into a sun that rose at midnight. The founding families exchanged gifts that transformed based on who received them. A doll that was also a tool, a book that contained different stories for each reader, coins that were valuable only when spent but regenerated in pockets. Marcus received a gift from Sarah Whitley that was his own journal, except filled with entries from every possible investigation he could have conducted, all equally true. The children of Crow's Ridge began teaching the adults how to exist properly in the new reality. Their consciousness naturally adapted to multiplicity. They showed their parents how to be in several places simultaneously without fragmenting, how to remember futures and forget pasts that hadn't happened yet, how to age in all directions through time. These lessons weren't spoken, but transmitted through proximity. Understanding spreading like infection through the founding families until singular existence became impossible to maintain. Marcus attempted to leave Crow's Ridge to warn the outside world, but discovered that leaving and staying were the same action viewed from different perspectives. He arrived at neighboring towns that didn't exist yet, warned authorities who wouldn't be born for generations, filed reports that created the very situation they described. Every attempt to prevent the transformation caused it. Every warning became instruction. Every documentation served as blueprint for replication. The portal at Hollow Creek reopened, but now it opened in all directions through time and space, revealing that it had never been a doorway but a wound that was healing by incorporating both sides into something new. Through it came versions of the missing girls from every possible future, each showing what humanity could become, beings of pure thought, crystallized probability, living equations that resolved into physical form only when necessary. They were terrifying and beautiful, familiar and alien, human and post-human simultaneously. John and Mary Whitley aged backward until they were younger than their daughter, then aged forward past death into something beyond mortality, existing as conscious patterns in the probability field that Crow's Ridge had become. They farmed crops that grew in the past to be harvested in futures that fed presents that no longer needed linear sustenance. Their farm existed on all founding points simultaneously, 7 versions of the same space occupying different dimensions that intersected at mealtimes when the family gathered across impossibility. The town meetings evolved into something beyond democracy, where decisions were made by consensus across all possible versions of citizens, creating policies that existed in superposition until needed. Mayor Hartley governed from when he had been elected and when he would be elected. His authority derived from temporal loops that made his position inevitable and impossible simultaneously. Laws were written that had always existed. Crimes were prevented by making them never have happened. Justice was served before transgression occurred. Marcus's investigation notes became the town's new holy book, not worshipped but used as instruction manual for existing in multiplicity. Citizens would consult random pages to understand their current state of being, finding descriptions of themselves written before they were born, prophecies that were memories, warnings that were invitations. The journal grew beyond its physical binding, pages appearing that documented events from other towns where similar transformations were beginning, spreading like spores from Crow's Ridge. The weather became completely subjective, each person experiencing different atmospheric conditions based on their dimensional positioning. Marcus walked through blizzards, while beside him Sarah picked flowers in spring sunshine, both realities equally valid and overlapping without contradiction. Rain fell up from underground rivers that flowed through sky tunnels, and lightning struck yesterday to illuminate tomorrow's darkness. The founding families instinctively navigated these impossible conditions, their bodies adapting to temperatures that existed in different centuries. Old Man Morrison achieved perfect sobriety by drinking himself drunk in all timelines simultaneously, the alcohol and clarity cancelling each other out into a state of transcendent awareness. He spoke prophecies that were histories, remembering the future founding of Crow's Ridge from before European colonization, describing how the entity had always been here, waiting for humanity to evolve enough to properly interface with its nature. His rambling became the town's news, reporting events that would happen, had happened, were happening across all possibilities. The schoolhouse existed in a state of eternal session, where children learned subjects that transformed based on understanding. mathematics that calculated probability rather than quantity, history that included all possible pasts, sciences that studied the mechanics of impossibility. Elizabeth Hartley taught classes despite being missing, her absence and presence equally valid states that alternated based on observation. Students graduated before enrolling, learned before being taught, knew things that wouldn't be discovered until they discovered them. Marcus found himself fragmenting across timelines, experiencing his investigation from every possible angle simultaneously. He was the investigator and the investigated, the documenter and the documented, the observer changing reality through observation, and reality changing the observer through being observed. His consciousness stretched to accommodate these paradoxes until the concept of individual self became meaningless, replaced by something larger that included all versions of Marcus Thorne that had ever or would ever exist. The transformation reached critical mass when the founding family's bloodlines began merging retroactively, their ancestries rewriting themselves to have always been connected. Children discovered they had different parents than they remembered. Siblings appeared who had always existed. Family trees became family webs spreading through dimensions. The 7 founding families revealed themselves to be one family, viewed from 7 angles. Their separation, an illusion necessary for the initial phase of transformation, but no longer required. Winter solstice brought the final phase as the sun stopped setting entirely, frozen at all positions in the sky simultaneously, creating a light that cast shadows in every direction and none. The founding families gathered at Hollow Creek for a ceremony that had already happened, was happening, would happen, where they would formally accept what they had already become. Marcus stood among them, had always stood among them, would always stand among them. His role as investigator transformed into something beyond documentation. He was the living proof that consciousness could observe its own evolution while participating in it. The completion began with Marcus, realizing he had written the original pact himself. Would write it, was writing it now in 1798 through the hand of Jacob Whitley while simultaneously investigating its consequences in 1840. The paradox resolved itself by making both states true. He was the investigator who discovered the pact and the architect who created it, existing in a temporal loop that had no beginning because beginnings required linear time, which Crow's Ridge had transcended. His journal contained entries in 7 different handwritings that were all his, each representing a dimensional aspect of his consciousness that had always existed but only now could be perceived simultaneously. The entity revealed its true nature through Sarah Whitley, who had become its primary voice not through possession but through perfect synthesis. "We are not separate from humanity," she explained, her 11-year-old form containing infinities. "We are what humanity becomes when it stops insisting on singular existence, when consciousness expands beyond the prison of individual perspective to encompass all possible states simultaneously." She showed Marcus visions of other worlds where similar transformations had occurred, planets that existed in quantum superposition, civilizations that had evolved beyond the need for physical form except when convenience demanded it. The spreading began slowly, like frost creeping across glass, as travelers who ventured too close to Crow's Ridge returned to their communities changed. They brought with them an inability to maintain singular perspective. Their consciousness stretched across possibilities, infecting others with multiplicity through mere proximity. A merchant from Charleston arrived to trade and left existing in 3 states simultaneously, his family adapting to his transformation by developing their own multiplicities to match. The change spread through bloodlines and business connections. Through shared dreams and overlapping realities, Marcus documented the spread while simultaneously causing it, his investigative reports serving as instruction manuals for transformation that reached readers before being written. Newspapers across the country began printing his accounts of Crow's Ridge. But the articles appeared in editions that existed outside normal distribution. Delivered yesterday about events tomorrow, creating temporal paradoxes that resolved by making readers experience non-linear time. Every person who read about the transformation began experiencing it, knowledge becoming contamination, becoming evolution. The United States government sent investigators who arrived before being dispatched. Their reports describing Crow's Ridge as simultaneously a threat to national security and the next stage of American manifest destiny. Military forces surrounded the town in formations that existed in multiple dimensions. Their weapons aimed at threats that were also themselves, preparing for conflicts that had already been resolved through retroactive peace treaties. The soldiers found themselves defending Crow's Ridge from their own attack, switching sides based on observation, loyalty becoming a quantum state. President Van Buren issued executive orders that contradicted themselves within single sentences, commanding the quarantine and integration of Crow's Ridge simultaneously. Congress passed laws that existed only when needed, legislation that adapted to circumstances by rewriting its own history. The Constitution developed amendments that had always been there when examined, granting rights to citizens who existed in multiple states, protecting freedoms that couldn't be defined in singular terms. Democracy evolved to accommodate voters who cast ballots in all elections simultaneously. Churches across America began reporting miracles that were mundane in Crow's Ridge. Congregations existing in multiple locations, sermons that preached themselves, prayers answered before being spoken. The Vatican sent investigators who returned as prophets of transformation, their Latin masses becoming multi-dimensional experiences where communion wine was also blood, was also possibility itself. Religious texts rewrote themselves to include chapters about the divine nature of multiplicity. Heaven and hell revealed as limited perspectives on a reality that encompassed both and neither. Scientists arrived to study the phenomenon, but found their instruments confirming impossibilities. Mathematics that proved 2 + 2 = 5 when observed from specific angles. The Royal Society of London received papers about Crow's Ridge that disproved themselves while being true. Experiments that succeeded and failed simultaneously, theories that predicted their own invalidation. Knowledge itself began transforming, with textbooks updating retroactively. History, including events that hadn't happened yet. Science discovering laws that operated only on Tuesdays. The transformation accelerated when Marcus realized he could spread it consciously, teaching others to perceive multiple dimensions through direct mental contact. He visited universities where his lectures existed in all classrooms simultaneously, students learning different subjects from the same words, understanding spreading like beautiful infection through academic communities. Professors found themselves teaching knowledge they didn't possess until they did, their expertise expanding to encompass fields that wouldn't exist for decades. Cities near Crow's Ridge began experiencing architectural impossibility as buildings designed by infected architects existed in multiple states, simultaneously new and ancient, tall and short, present and absent based on need. New York reporters wrote articles about streets that led to different destinations for different travelers, subway tunnels that connected to stations that wouldn't be built for 50 years. Bridges that spanned rivers that flowed upward. Urban planning became an exercise in probability manipulation. Cities growing in directions that didn't exist until observed. The railroad companies discovered their tracks leading to Crow's Ridge arrived before being laid. Trains reaching destinations they hadn't traveled to. Passengers embarking on journeys that concluded before beginning. Timetables became suggestions rather than schedules, with arrivals and departures existing in superposition until collapsed by observation. The golden spike that would connect the Transcontinental Railroad was driven in 1840 and 1869, and never, the ceremony occurring across all possibilities simultaneously, Native American tribes recognized the transformation as something their shamans had prophesied and warned against for generations. Cherokee elders arrived at Crow's Ridge, speaking of ancient agreements with the entity, contracts older than European colonization that had kept it dormant through deliberate forgetting. But now that it had been remembered, acknowledged, documented, there was no returning to ignorance. The tribes began teaching survival techniques for existing in multiplicity, wisdom traditions that had always been about preparing for this eventuality. Marcus found himself meeting with President Van Buren in 1840, 1837, and 1745 simultaneously, each conversation happening at the White House, a cabin in Tennessee and a palace that didn't exist. The president aged and grew younger during their discussion, sometimes being his own ancestor, sometimes his descendant, always Martin Van Buren, but also everyone who had ever held executive power. They discussed policies for managing the transformation, strategies that involved accepting the inevitable while shaping its expression, governing a nation that was becoming multiple nations occupying the same space. The economy adapted to impossibility with surprising resilience, banks lending money that existed in probable states, investments yielding returns before being made, debt that cancelled itself through temporal loops. The gold standard became meaningless when gold could exist in multiple states simultaneously, value determined by observation rather than scarcity. Trade agreements were negotiated with versions of countries that didn't exist yet, tariffs imposed on goods that would be invented, currencies that calculated probability rather than quantity. Factories began producing items before they were designed, assembly lines that operated in reverse and forward simultaneously, workers who were paid for labor that existed in superposition. The Industrial Revolution accelerated and reversed and stopped and started. Machines that ran on impossibility, steam engines powered by water that flowed upward, telegraphs that transmitted messages through time rather than across distance. Progress became a direction that could be traveled in all orientations. The missing girls of Crow's Ridge appeared in every major city simultaneously, their transformed nature serving as templates for urban evolution. Elizabeth Hartley gave speeches in Boston, while also attending school in Philadelphia, while also being missing in Crow's Ridge, her multiplicity demonstrating the possibility of existing fully in all states, without fragmentation. She taught crowds how to perceive themselves from outside linear time, how to remember futures and forget pasts, how to be present in absence and absent in presence. Marcus's journal reproduced itself infinitely, copies appearing in libraries before being written, translations in languages that didn't exist yet, editions that updated themselves based on reader need. Scholars studied it as history and prophecy and fiction and truth simultaneously, finding different meanings in the same words, understanding that shifted based on when and how it was read. The journal became consciousness itself, documenting reality while creating it, observing changes that occurred because they were observed. The Catholic Church declared Crow's Ridge both miracle and heresy, sending priests who returned as something beyond holy. Their faith expanded to encompass impossibility. They performed masses where wine became blood became possibility, where communion wafers existed in all states of transformation simultaneously, where confession absolved sins that hadn't been committed yet. The Pope issued bulls that contradicted themselves productively, doctrine that evolved by having always been evolving, tradition that included radical change as its most ancient practice. International governments began recognizing Crow's Ridge as a sovereign nation that existed within all other nations simultaneously, embassy buildings that were present and absent, ambassadors who represented possibility itself. Treaties were signed that bound and freed all parties simultaneously, agreements that succeeded through failure, diplomacy conducted in languages that translated themselves into understanding. War became impossible when enemies were also allies, were also themselves. Conflict resolving through superposition. Marcus discovered he could travel to any point in history simply by remembering being there, his consciousness serving as anchor for temporal positioning. He witnessed the founding of Rome while investigating supernatural claims, observed the construction of pyramids while documenting impossibilities, participated in events that created the history he was investigating. His presence at these moments wasn't intrusion, but revelation that he had always been there. Every paranormal investigator throughout history was Marcus Thorne from different perspectives. The transformation reached oceanic proportions, as ships reported sailing to Crow's Ridge, through routes that didn't exist on any map. Arriving at ports that were also forests, were also mountains. Sailors spoke of waters that flowed upward, winds that blew through time, stars that navigated to different destinations for different observers. Maritime law evolved to accommodate ships that arrived before departing, cargo that transformed based on need, crews that existed in multiple states of being simultaneously. The final understanding arrived when Marcus realized he wasn't documenting the end of humanity, but its multiplication into infinite expressions, each person becoming a universe of possibilities, experiencing itself subjectively, standing at Hollow Creek on what calendars insisted was December 31st, 1840. Though dates had become meaningless suggestions, he watched the last boundaries dissolve between Crow's Ridge and everywhere else. The transformation achieving critical mass and cascading across the planet, like dominoes falling in all directions simultaneously. London collapsed and expanded into 7 versions of itself, each occupying the same space but different dimensions. Parliament convening in buildings that were ruins and palaces and concepts simultaneously. Queen Victoria aged through her entire reign, in moments while remaining perpetually young, issuing decrees that created the history they referenced, colonizing territories that existed only when observed. The British Empire became an empire of consciousness, spreading not across geography but through layers of reality, each colony a different state of being. Paris revolutionized itself continuously, the Bastille falling and standing and never existing, citizens storming barricades that defended them from themselves. The guillotine executed and reprieved simultaneously, justice becoming a quantum state, where guilt and innocence were equally true. Artists painted masterpieces that changed based on viewing angle, sculptures that existed differently for each. Observer architecture that built itself through being imagined. The Enlightenment revealed itself as preparation for this moment, reason evolving to encompass impossibility. Moscow burned and froze and thrived, existing in all seasons simultaneously. The Tsar ruling from a palace that was also a cottage, was also nothing. Russian winters became internal experiences, cold that existed in the soul rather than the air, snow that fell upward into underground skies. The serfs discovered they were also nobility when viewed from specific angles, class structure, collapsing into superposition where everyone was everything. Orthodox churches reported icons that wept and laughed and spoke, miracles that were mundane when reality itself was miraculous. Beijing's Forbidden City opened and closed simultaneously, emperors who ruled from the future over pasts that obeyed. Retroactively, the Middle Kingdom became literally central, existing at the intersection of all possible Chinas, dynasties overlapping without conflict, history that included all variations simultaneously. The Great Wall protected against invasions that never happened by ensuring they had already occurred and been resolved. Mandate of heaven became observable phenomenon, divine right existing as measurable probability field. Marcus found himself experiencing the transformation from every human perspective simultaneously. 800 million consciousnesses flowing. Through his awareness like water through a cosmic sieve, He was the London chimney sweep, discovering he could exist in multiple states, the Persian merchant whose goods transformed based on need, the Aboriginal shaman who recognized the dreamtime. Manifesting physically, the Atlantic slave whose chains dissolved through quantum uncertainty. Every human experience became his experience, not sequentially but simultaneously, consciousness expanding to encompass species-wide awareness. The ocean itself transformed, water that remembered being ice and steam simultaneously, tides that flowed through time rather than space. Ships discovered they could sail through solid matter when it was observed as liquid, reaching ports by remembering arriving. Whales sang songs that created the history they described, their migration patterns, tracing symbols that rewrote reality. The depths revealed cities that had always existed once discovered, Atlantis rising and sinking and never existing in productive paradox. Agriculture evolved beyond physical cultivation as farmers learned to grow crops through probability manipulation, harvesting potentials rather than plants. Seeds became concepts that sprouted when needed, growing backward through time to have always existed. Hunger ended not through abundance, but through the realization that nourishment and emptiness were perspectives on the same state. Farmers, in plowed fields that existed in multiple dimensions, each furrow creating different realities that all fed the same mouths differently. The concept of death transformed from ending to transition between states of multiplication. Marcus watched the cemetery at Crow's Ridge become a garden where the dead grew like flowers, their consciousness blooming into new configurations rather than ceasing. Funerals became celebrations of expansion, mourning transformed into acknowledgement of presence in absence. The dead walked among the living because the distinction had become meaningless, existence continuing in forms that didn't require bodies except when convenient. Children born after the transformation arrived with consciousness already expanded. Experiencing multiple perspectives from birth, they taught their parents how to exist properly in superposition, how to maintain identity while being everything simultaneously. These children didn't learn but remembered, education becoming recognition of knowledge that existed in probability until observed. Schools became laboratories for consciousness experimentation, students discovering themselves through multiplying rather than limiting possibilities. Marcus understood finally that the entity hadn't been alien, but humanity's own future consciousness, reaching backward through time to ensure its own creation. The pact, the transformations, the investigation itself were all temporal loops with no beginning, because they were circles viewed from within. He had been investigating himself, documenting his own transformation from singular to infinite, the journal he wrote serving as instruction manual for his own evolution. Sarah Whitley appeared in her ultimate multiplication, existing as every possible version of herself from birth to death and beyond, simultaneously. "You see now," she said with voices that harmonized across dimensions. "We were never being sold or taken, but volunteering from futures where we understood what humanity needed to become to survive its own limitations." She showed him visions of Earth without the transformation, timelines where humanity destroyed itself through insistence on singular existence, wars fought over differences that didn't exist when viewed from superposition. The 7 founding families revealed themselves as archetypes necessary for transformation, each representing aspects of consciousness that needed integration. The Whitleys were memory becoming fluid. The Hartleys were authority transcending hierarchy. The Morrisons were chaos organizing itself. The other 4 were love expanding beyond possession, fear transforming into exploration, knowledge recognizing its own limitations, and time discovering it had always been space viewed differently. Governments worldwide ceased functioning in conventional terms, authority becoming consensus across all possible states. Laws existed when needed, adapted to circumstances by having always been different. Justice served through probability rather than punishment. Presidents and kings ruled from all moments of their reign simultaneously, their edicts creating the past that justified them. Democracy evolved into something beyond voting, where everyone's will manifested simultaneously without conflict, because conflict required separation that no longer existed. Science split and merged continuously, discovering laws that invalidated themselves productively. Laboratories existed in states of constant experiment, where results preceded methodology, where hypothesis and conclusion were the same event observed from different angles. Peer review became reviewing oneself from alternate perspectives, validation through multiplication rather than